I already made my meme video to get all the salt out of my system, and so the purpose of this one is to be an attempt at giving as honest, as non-exaggerated feedback about Paragon as I possibly can. Additionally, I'll try to provide ideas for possible updates and fixes at the end of the video. My general thoughts about Paragon are as follows. Paragon improves what was already strongest part of Warrior's support builds, while neglecting some of the problems that kept those builds down, especially in versus modes. And majority of options Paragon brings are straight downgrades to something else already available in Warrior's Call toolkit. Only truly unique utilities Paragon brings are either underpowered or are competing for slots with something more important. The result is that Paragon is the worst in slot spec for everything other than Alac heal or supporting specifically tanky bunkerish builds in PvP or World Reward. Now let's get to the details. Starting with the elephant in the room, class mechanic. Overall idea of chants and refrains is decent enough to hold its own ground, but it seems underbaked. Chant activations were clearly meant not to be the focus of the mechanic, as they do borderline nothing. The problem, however, with that is that putting skills' entire power budget in upkeep-based passive effect tends to leave situations when damage, utility, defenses, healing or anything of that matter is needed fast uncovered, and those situations happen in Guild Wars 2 more often than not. Moreover, current chant iterations are very shallow and seemingly not thought through. Chant and refrain of action provides might and fury, two boons which in PvE Warrior has so easy access to, it takes genuine effort to make a Warrior build that doesn't cap might. This chant only has value in versus modes, or as vehicle to activate Feverish Pulse. Refrain of Recuperation adds flat overtime healing to a class that has already a tendency to misuse support tools for side node self-sustain, like Spellbreaker did with Staff for 3 bloody years, forcing multiple rounds of nerfs. This is likely going to create a side node bunker build sooner or later, and my immediate question is, why doesn't Refrain of Recuperation make your self-only heals into AoE ones, sort of like Medical Dispersion Field does for Engineer? That way, we would have improved Warrior's supportive capabilities tenfold or more without increasing its potential maximum self-sustain, preventing the bunker build from manifesting. Chant and Refrain of Freedom are on paper the most valuable ones, but also the most useless ones in practice, as the stun break from Chant of Freedom cannot be used while crowd controlled, so its potential value as something allowing you to run less CC countermeasures in your utilities is completely lost. Moreover, the 3-second delay between Chant activation and the Refrain giving it stability makes it so using this Chant preventatively as a CC countermeasure is only possible if you upkeep it permanently, which is unsustainable and stands in the way of you providing Alacrity to the group. Not to mention, it's annoying to deal with in PvP. And finally, the weapon bursts being locked to level 1 are a significant DPS loss for Paragon in all 3 game modes. In PvP, core level 1 bursts were balanced around Spellbreaker's ability to cooldown reset them, and in PvE, it's almost expected that Warrior will consistently have Adrenaline to access level 2 and 3 weapon bursts. Meaning that Paragon would need damage padding in its traits to fulfill Alac DPS role, which he doesn't have, making him unable to Alac DPS, let alone pure DPS, due to lack of aforementioned DPS. Speaking of Alac, Paragon's current Alacrity generation trait, Feverish Pulse, grants you Alacrity on switching from one refrain to a different one, meaning you have to first be in a refrain to grant Alac upon swapping it. In cases of warriors existing quick and Alac builds, signature boon application is tied to the same adrenaline expenditure as its prot uptime is, to weapon bursts, and it doesn't have any other prerequisite than having adrenaline to access those signature boons. Paragon, however, adds completely separate set of adrenaline skills that have to be alternated between on their own interval and its own unique prerequisite, unnecessarily increasing complexity of the class with no benefit to it, and almost doubling the necessary adrenaline input to just provide necessary boons. If Feverish Pulse simply gave Alacrity on Chant activation, the trait could be made independent from other traits with no negative impact to moment-to-moment gameplay, but allowing for more build variety, as traits like Call to Action and Invigorating Tempo would become options, not requirements. And Paragon needs to have its selection of trait options strongly improved, because as of right now, its traits are so focused at forcing it into support role that build and gameplay variety was thrown out of the window. Its only damage trait is competing for spotlight with Alac generation trait, and Paragon's entire total available damage increase is 20% from that one specific trait. Other warrior elite specs have either multiple traits increasing damage, or have mechanics with specifically high damage scalings like Berserker's Primal Burst or Blade Swan's Dragon Slashes. Paragon has the exact opposite situation. Its mechanics deprive it of damage options core warrior has access to, and its traits are devoid of damage options, making it functionally unable to play DPS or boon DPS role. Speaking of trait choices, from 9 traits Paragon can choose between, 6 are inherently supportive in nature, and remaining 3 are at least slightly leaning in that direction. And what's worse, majority of those support traits either add no value or are competing with something more important to run or with each other. Calming Tongue increases the healing power and concentration on a class that doesn't need either of those increases due to innately high numbers and healing built into its mechanic. Enduring Refrain is a dead trait in PvE because no one will play support Paragon without Alac generation. Not to mention its additional effects of increased boon duration and increased healing are basically the same as that of Calming Tongue, which is already redundant. Brisk Pacing was also made redundant by Alac generation no longer requiring it, since base duration was increased between Livestream Showcase and the beta. And Reverberation will not see play because commands aren't worth running even with Reverberation. We Shall Return being the only exception, as that's the only AoE by default heal skill Warrior has access to, so it has no competition in typical PvE raid strike build. You could have straight up removed Calming Tongue, Enduring Refrain, Brisk Pacing and Reverberation, and probably no Paragon build would be negatively affected. And that's because 6 out of 9 Paragon trait choices are trying to force into existence one support build, which didn't need 5 of them to begin with. And so the traits in question compete with each other, making all but the best of them redundant, and just waste of design space that could be used to facilitate multiple distinct Paragon builds. In versus modes, Paragon fares a little better, as it's not obligated to run Feverish Pulse, so it can actually run other Grandmaster traits. And here is my first praise, as the idea of gameplay involving strengthening stances is genuinely fun, and switching between refrains for either damage increase or reduction is just enough of an addition to warp-based gameplay to make it feel distinct. Unfortunately, however, in practice that doesn't work as well as it could. You see, Chants normally have cast times, despite doing borderline nothing on activation by design, so you can't switch refrains while casting anything else, which undermines the fun factor and makes its gameplay feel less responsive, and less reliable, especially considering Warrior's general reliance on long animations like Line Breaker, 100 Blades, Flurry, Shield Stance and Bullet Catcher to name a few. Paragon's other builds are even worse, as delay between activating a chant and refrain giving you its effects encourages sitting in one refrain as much as possible, favoring Refrain of Freedom if you run Enduring Refrains and Refrain of Recuperation if you don't. The issue with Paragon's traits from PvE repeats here as well, as every trait column has a clear best choice. Feverish Pulse existing allows for some interesting high quickness uptime Paragon builds, and Enduring Refrain allows for permanent group stability, but both of these seem to be fraction as useful even on full support setup as the damage increase, damage reduction, and movement speed from strengthening stances. Feverish Pulse and Enduring Refrain could probably be merged into one trait, and they still would likely remain the weaker option between them and stanzas. One undisputably positive addition, however, is that all burst traits other than Soldier's Focus are by default activated upon casting a chant. This makes it so Paragon becomes much better user of traits such as Heightened Focus than for example Spellbreaker is, so there is a noticeable uptick in healing it can do even without Refrain of Recuperation. On the other hand, commands Paragon gets are definitely balanced around Reverberation being used. For On Your Knees, Reverberation is flat out 33% damage increase. For We Shall Return, it's almost 40% more healing. For Find Their Weakness, it's double the might. For Brace Yourselves, it's 33% more barrier. You get the deal, right? However, even with Reverberation, those commands seem underpowered. I know because I'm probably the only person in the community that actually played and tested them. Sure, We Shall Return has the upside of being the only AoE by default heal skill in Warrior's arsenal, but with its numbers, which are displayed incorrectly on the tooltip by the way, that upside only matters in PvE, as in versus modes, Shrug It Off plus Vigorous Shouts builds have more AoE heal on to the limit, which is the default option. Same applies to Brace Yourselves in comparison to Banner of Defense. Banner is just doing the same thing, but better. Overtime nature and additional resource cost would imply that every command skill is going to be strong or have powerful utility. But in pretty much any metric, even with Reverberation, every command is weaker than their closest equivalent or default option from Warrior's base toolkit for overwhelming majority of builds and cases. On Your Knees and Never Surrender being the only exceptions as they don't have a close enough analog. Never Surrender initial cast only applies boons to yourself and echoes only to allies, removing its entire potential as replacement for Banner of Tactics in upkeeping resistance and resolution, while the only value from On Your Knees comes from its damage in PvP, which with Reverberation is just enough to let Paragon confirm hard CC into kills on half health targets, which most warrior builds can do on full health targets. Reverberation could be made baseline and commands would still need buffs. And that's not yet everything. Elite command, We Will Never Yield, is a concept that unfortunately cannot work in practice. The death prevention effect does not stack duration. If you activate Echo with a burst before your original death prevention expires, you don't receive new effect, nor barrier from it. The value of the new effect is just being lost on every target that already has death prevention on it, which technically means that your elite command punishes the user for skipping its delay with bursts, which is the exact thing all commands are specifically designed to reward. This is further exacerbated by Reverberation, making the same problem apply not just to yourself, but to your teammates as well. To not lose uptime or barrier from your elite, you have to abstain from using your best skills for its entire duration. Unfortunately, this problem cannot be fixed. We cannot make the death prevention duration stacking, as that would invite the risk of stacking Paragons becoming the go-to cheese strategy, and Arena are cautious enough of it already that they made death prevention not work against insta-kill mechanics in PvE, and I'm guessing things like fall damage as well. This, however, can't really be extended to player versus player interactions, as making something other than fall damage kill through death prevention would simply be unfair to the user. But on the other hand, duration stacking or even refreshable death prevention would almost instantly spawn a toxic bunker build or even a toxic bunker team comp into existence. Moreover, We Will Never Yield competes for the spot with Battle Standard, which does the same job better, as fixing other people's mistakes afterward with a revive is much more consistent than trying to time your death prevention in a way that will stop the mistake in real time, especially considering that so-called death prevention doesn't prevent insta-kill mechanics, so it can't prevent anything Battle Standard couldn't fix. And without you being on point with healing the teammate you just saved with death prevention, he might go down immediately after the effect expires, because it leaves them at 1 health with some barrier, and you still need to dedicate time, effort and attention to babysit them back to full health, whereas Revive immediately pops them back up at reasonable health percentage. And finally, the subjective portion. Paragon is clearly lacking in terms of visual design. The sound design of the spec is, depending on race of your character, somewhat good to genuinely awe-inspiring, with Asuras obviously sounding the least impressive. No amount of reverb added to a squeaky toy is going to make it sound threatening. But for remaining races, chants and commands pack an acoustic punch worthy of praise. Unfortunately, that is juxtaposed by command and chant's own visuals, which range from unassuming healing particles to a brown cloud expanding from below my character, making it look like if my character had a cabbage feast few hours ago and was now turning into human equivalent of a chemical reactor. To be perfectly honest, shockwaves the likes of which were implemented on staff animations would make much more sense and wouldn't visually suggest poison application. Moreover, Paragon's signature wings only appearing for the elite skill casting is the waste of only good visual Paragon has on something that's disappointing in general, let alone in comparison to its closest competitor, Battle Standard. And of course, there are some missing visuals like On Your Knees eco visuals, but I'm almost certain that is just a bug. And for me, that's basically all feedback regarding visuals I have. Now, how would I fix Paragon? First of all, I would make Paragon's mechanics interact with Warrior's toolkit instead of just turning it into a walking heal and boon dispenser. Warrior already has incredibly good selfish utility, and it would benefit much more from getting an option to share its utility than from getting passive AoE healing aura. I would make a Refrain of Recuperation turn your self-only healing and cleansing into AoE healing and cleansing, affecting allies within the same range as Refrain currently does. It would not double already shared effects, such as Vigorous Shouts, We Shall Return, or Staff Healing. Percentage of healing transferred would scale with Motivation Threshold, respectively 33, 66 and 100% healing would be transferred on low, mid and high motivation thresholds. Cleansing would be limited to 1, 2 and 3 conditions cleansed per target per interval at respective thresholds. This way, Paragon could potentially heal and cleanse allies with his heal skills like Mending or traits like Brawler's Recovery, Might Mix Right, Adrenal Health, or of course, Invigorating Tempo, making his healing potential very good without increasing his self-sustain by a proxy. Chant of Freedom would not only break stuns on activation, but also knock enemies back, buying you space in PvP, or letting you damage those Defiance bars in PvE. Refrain of Freedom would share Warrior's trait effects like Refrain of Recuperation shares healing, but would be limited to traits that affect movement impairments such as Liberating Lease and Warrior's Spirit. It would no longer grant stability but resistance on high motivation thresholds. Additionally, the variable cooldown idea ArenaNet introduced to skills like Never Surrender would be applied to it as well, allowing it to be cast while CC'd, but also without Adrenaline, though both would increase its cooldown by 50%, up to 100% increase if both conditions are met. Chant of Action would only receive Cone AoE damaging hit on activation, exactly the same size and damage as Path to Victory used to have before September 10th, 2024 patch. Otherwise, it would remain unaffected and serve as main button to activate traits. Paragon's weapon bursts I'd make scale like core warriors bursts do, but going up one level every time you cast a chant, instead of scaling with adrenaline. Their level would reset after each use. Trait-wise, there are two traits that are borderline necessary to run, which are Invigorating Tempo and Call to Action. I'd make Invigorating Tempo a minor Grandmaster trait in place of Unyielding Resolve. Call to Action is mainly needed just because you have to be in a refrain for casting new chant to grant Alacrity. I would change Feverish Pulse so it grants Alacrity on burst cast or on entering a refrain you weren't previously in, so Call to Action becomes an option, not an obligation to run. Calming Tongue improves raw healing numbers, what warrior is already best in slot 4. I would remove it and replace with Blade Turn Refrain, a callback to Guild Wars 1 Paragon, trait which would grant ages around you every time you cast a chant. Liberating Lease would remain as it is, but would also grant increased power damage if you have swiftness, exactly like Warrior's Sprint does. Effects of Inspiring Implements would get baked into Rally the Valiant, and Unyielding Resolve would be slotted in its current place. Brisk Pacing would be changed to pulse one cleanse as well as a small amount of vigor and healing every time you give yourself 5 or more adrenaline with a skill. In the slot where Invigorating Tempo used to reside, a new trait, Anthem of Envy, would be slotted, which would give you an effect similar to Burst Precision that for 2 seconds after every burst cast would improve your critical hit damage and make your hits apply Torment to the enemies with 1/4 second internal cooldown on Torment application. Reverberation would become baseline for all chants, and new trait would be put in its place. Burning Shield would make it so whenever you are channeling a skill that blocks, a dome will be projected around you, blocking projectiles and applying burning to enemies inside. Feverish Pulse would be combined with Enduring Refrain. New trait Anthem of Flame would be put in place of Feverish Pulse, which would give your allies quickness and similar effect to Ashes of Just every time you activate a chant. You'd give to yourself similar effect to Burst Precision that for 2 seconds after every burst would make your hits apply burning to the enemies with 1/4 second internal cooldown between applications. You would also get increased crit chance against burning foes. Strengthening stanzas would remain unchanged. Enduring Refrain would not improve your specific refrains, but instead would make them stick around for one more interval after you switch to a different refrain. Motivation reduction cost would exist as previously to accommodate for lingering refrains. This trait would also grant Alacrity in PvE only every time you activate a chant. Commands besides the Reverberation becoming baseline would have changes as follows. We Shall Return would apply regeneration on all pulses, initial and echoes, and its range would be increased to 600. Find Their Weakness would have its initial hit damage increased by 20%. Additionally to its previous effects, it would give unblockable stacks to allies on its echoes like Linebreaker does, increased for how many enemies initial hit connected with. Never Surrender would give its boons to both allies and yourself on initial pulse and echoes, but base duration of those boons would be reduced to 3 seconds. Protection would be added to its previous effects. Brace Yourself would grant block stacks to yourself and allies, like Weapon of Warding does, but stacks would last for 3 seconds instead of 5. On Your Knees would have its damage on each proc increased by 20%, and it would apply Cripple on every hit. We Will Never Yield would be fully reworked. Instead of providing death prevention effect that has to be made unfun and underwhelming for balanced reasons, how about something more fun? How about Support Rampage? We Will Never Yield would cap your motivation, increase your model size by 10%, and activate all 3 of your refrains at once, and give you a separate effect that refunds all motivation spent for the duration. Furthermore, its echoes would pulse a blast of pure force of will that deals damage to the enemies and heals, cleanses, and partially revives allies in 360 range around you. This skill would persist and let you keep casting echoes until your motivation refund effect expires, and you naturally run out of motivation due to the total cost of 7 motivation per interval, 5 if you have enduring refrains. Of course, the wings would be visible for the entire duration of the skill. Closing thoughts. I of course don't expect my idea to be implemented, nor am I convinced that my ideas are flawless. The very words, my idea, imply that the idea is flawed to some extent, because I have a self-esteem of a trench foot. And so, treat my feedback and ideas as what they are. Feedback and ideas. They are only meant to help. And I hope they somehow will. Before this thing completely concludes, an obligatory big sign of gratitude to all the generous supporters, continuously considering my dubious quality content worth their money. You're all truly welcome. Crabface out.